Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for our LeaseCake Live session today. My name is Michelle Benjamin. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at LeaseCake, and we're so happy that you could take your time out of your day to join us. Before we jump into the presentation, I'll give you a quick introduction while everyone's joining the room. Who is LeaseCake? Just in case you weren't sure. If you're not a customer, we are a lease and location management platform specifically serving restaurants, service-based retail, health and fitness, pretty much every industry. We serve tens of thousands of locations, hundreds of brands across many industries, especially Planet Fitness, as you will hear from shortly. So this is not a sales pitch. We're not here to talk about LeaseCake necessarily. We are here to be educational and helpful. So this is a time when we bring our customers, our partners, and other industry experts together to share their stories, their ideas, and advice to help everyone else. So the topic today, as you are probably aware, is due diligence and mergers and acquisitions. We're here to learn how to streamline those M&A transactions so you can close your deals faster and not hit any hiccups. And before I pass it over to Taj to introduce our speakers, just two housekeeping items. Yes, we are recording this. We'll be sharing it out with you, everyone who registered, in case you want to listen again. I'll send it out later today or tomorrow. And we definitely want to keep this interactive. So we encourage your questions throughout. You don't have to wait till the end. Just send them over using the Q&A box, and we'll keep an eye out on them and try and address them as they come in. So with that, I will introduce our moderator, who you may already know if you've joined a previous LeaseCake Live session, and that is LeaseCake's founder, Taj Adhav. Taj, take it away.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. We are super excited and thrilled to have you here today in our kitchen. We're coming at you live from Winter Park, Florida. And it's a webinar that's absolutely critical, as Michelle said, for multi-unit operators and franchisees across multiple industries, whether you're preparing to expand, sell, acquire. The ability to manage those leases and contracts and key docs efficiently can make or break the success of your deal and of your business. Private equity is a big fuel for M&A and due diligence for sure, capital markets. And our expert speakers today will guide you through the best practices, strategies to ensure your due diligence process is as smooth and seamless as possible. So let me introduce them to you. First off, one of our senior real estate managers at LeaseCake is joining today. And she's been working in the real estate and lease administration space for over 15 years, probably touched maybe, 50 billion pages of leases is my guess. And if you're a LeaseCake customer, you may have already had the pleasure of working with her. Please welcome Tara Hudson.
Hi, everyone. And Taj, I'm not sure, that might be a low estimate. It's probably a higher number, but.
Ooh, look at you. We'll have to keep a counter, a page counter for sure. Next, the Executive Vice President of Development and the in-house counsel for core development and management. They're an independent franchisee of Planet Fitness, and he's previously worked at Planet Fitness Corporate as their associate general counsel. And now at CDM, he's focused on growing and expanding through acquisitions and other strategic growth initiatives. Welcome, Steve Venezia.
Great to be here, Taj. Thank you for having me.
Well, aside from the fact that in the 5th grade, you wrote yourself a letter that you wanted to be an attorney, I'll never forget that. Why don't we start with you? You've been a guest before. Talk about your firsthand experience with M&A transactions. Don't be humble. You've been a customer of ours for, I think, probably going on 4 years now. Tell us your story, specifically as it relates to M&A, acquisitions, the kinds of deals you've touched.
Yeah, I mean, obviously in my legal background, I was in private practice for about 7 years, did a bunch of M&A in that arena, in all facets, actually represented banks as well in M&A transactions. So that was really interesting. But on the Planet Fitness side, both in my experience at headquarters and with the franchisee, we've done 7 major transactions just in the last 4 years. So it's been hot and heavy with M&A in the Planet Fitness system, and we've certainly been a part of that. And we've utilized a bunch of tools, obviously during our due diligence phase, LeaseCake being one of them.
Okay, so let's go through the steps as a buyer. What typically happens when you're on the buying side of a transaction?
Generally, I think you find that acquisition target, and then you're negotiating the framework of the deal. then, you turn that framework either into an IOI or an LOI, letter of intent. And then once that's signed, you really start to collect the information and doing the due diligence in earnest, right? So that's where really, I think the due diligence phase begins. From a real estate perspective, that's when you start reviewing those leases, amendments, estoppels, and then beyond the leasing and real estate side, right? You have a whole diligence, a data room opened, right, with financial documentation, operational documentation, legal documentation, property documentation, et cetera, et cetera. And, you go through reviewing that information. And, from my perspective with the leasing, certainly that's when you're abstracting and understanding those leases and really making sure you understand what they say.
Got it. So those 7 transactions that you've been involved with, put that in terms of the size, number of units.
Yeah, so I mean, they range from 12 units down to 1 unit. So we've done a number of different transactions. We've grown since 2020. We had 38 locations in 2020, and we are at 80 locations today. Some of those are organic growth, new builds, but a lot of them are acquisitions. So those 7 transactions have ranged in size. And, it's interesting because you'd think a much higher number of units would lead to a significant amount of more work. It's actually not the case necessarily, right? Once you get past that 3-4 units, it's just a ton of work, no matter how many units you're acquiring.
Got it. Yeah. So Tara, why don't you touch on some of those initial topics, like when the process starts? What have you seen typically with buyers?
If you start before the actual acquisition, it's a different animal. There's different things you're looking for. Getting an estoppel is the first and best thing that we hope to see when we're looking at documents here at LeaseCake. You are ensuring that you know the information before you go in. We've seen a lot of folks who acquire these locations and they don't even know when they expire, how many options they have. There's just so much missing information. So the earlier you can start, and I'm sure Steve will explain why it can be complicated to get some of these documents. So making every effort to get every lease document you can as early as possible is great, but it's not always possible.
Yeah, and if I could, Taj, I mean, that's so critically important. You're right, Tara, because you want to understand what the leases say first and foremost, right? And some critical things that we've come across over the years is you might lose your options. If you're assigning a lease, right? The options might go away. Your exclusivity provision might go away. Other benefits that the seller negotiated in a lease may go away upon assignment. Another big thing is whether or not consent is even required, right? You don't want to assume that consent is required when it's not required, and you do not want to alert the landlord of that. Now, the difficulty there is, can you get that estoppel that Tara was talking about, if you don't require consent and things like that? That estoppel for us is one of the most critical documents, because then you have a signed document that says, hey, these are the terms as agreed upon as the date of the assignment. We think this is the expiration date. We agree that this is the expiration date. This is the next rent escalation date. This is the option renewal deadline, et cetera. So if you can put those key terms in an estoppel, I think it's very beneficial to have that. And obviously it helps with the go forward.
Okay, so let's translate this in layman's terms. An estoppel certificate, an estoppel letter is really what?
Sorry.
Sure.
Typically, it's the tenant that signs it. In an acquisition, you kind of want the landlord to sign this estoppel, but you're basically saying, these are the terms. This is what we've agreed to. There's no defaults, or there are defaults. You want to get everything out in the open, and you sign it and you are swearing that this is true. So later the buyer can hold you to it. If you sign this and you say these things are true, you are stopped. You are unable to go back on your word, especially if the landlord has taken action on that and agrees with it too. Even if it's, contradictory to your lease.
Yeah. So do sellers have the estoppel certs, or what's the conversation or chain of communication to start to ask that, Steve, in terms of beginning the steps to gather those critical docs?
Yeah, it probably depends on the sophistication of the sellers and buyers relatively, right? A lot of times I'm preparing those certificates. I'm in a unique position where I'm an attorney and development persons, but in most cases, you would have your attorney prepare the estoppel certificate, or, and again, estoppel is a legal term, right? Legal term of art. I'm not afraid to call it a confirmation of lease terms. It has the same impact, I believe, whether it's called an estoppel or whether it's called a confirmation of lease terms, but a confirmation of lease terms might be a little bit less intimidating to a landlord when they see an estoppel, because that's the financial document a lot of times banks require in order to grant financing and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. What kind of unfavorable terms do you typically flag immediately?
Anything you're relinquishing, I think, is really important. You need to understand anything you're relinquishing, whether it's an exclusivity, whether it's a self-help right, whether it's a co-tenancy clause, anything like that. Options critically important, and you want to flag those, and you want to understand that, because that is going to fundamentally change the negotiation of the underlying deal. Right? If you won't go into a lease and you thought you had 2 years left on the lease, but you had, 2 5-year options, that is a more valuable asset, right, to that buyer than a lease with just 2 years left on it. Because with 2 years left on it, as we all understand from a real estate perspective, you need to be negotiating right now on either a relocation or an extension with that landlord. And those economic terms may change completely. So the deal terms then would change.
Tara, you want to add anything to that?
Only that I don't see it all the time, but we do see it frequently where you do lose these rights. So it is something, like Steve was saying, that is critically important. Just today, I looked at a lease where the rights were not assignable unless the landlord chose to allow you to have the renewal rights. So that is something that you can only identify if you look before, if you get all the lease documents before the acquisition.
Yeah.
And obviously this is a due diligence webinar, but that is something, like, anybody negotiating the lease, don't let that in there. Don't forfeit those rights upon assignment, because by and large, we're all going to sell our businesses at some point. You don't want to deal with that.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a really important fact, Tara, because there's notice provisions before an assignment happens. So I guess you need to know exactly what that time frame is, because a landlord can hold you hostage. What have you seen, Steve, with those kinds of notices?
Yeah.
Those typical.
Yeah. I mean, I've had relatively good relationships with landlords, right? And relatively reasonable landlords. So we haven't dealt with that too much, Taj. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you had a hard landlord, and really what that's going to come down to is what your rent, or what your market is, right? Because if that landlord has a replacement tenant available for that space, or you are on a significantly below market rent, of course they're going to try to leverage that situation either to get higher rents or to get a new tenant in there if they desire that, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we had talked about the importance of communication. Is this all typically, via email, faxes, and that kind of thing, or what works best, Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a proponent of sort of a cadence, right? So there might be an initial written communication just to start the introduction, whether that's an email followed up by, we'll often do kind of a form letter that says, hey, here's an introduction to the buyer, just so that they're aware. I think it does help just open the door a little bit. And then shortly thereafter, I think it's really incredibly important to set up a call. There is nothing that substitutes for a live conversation where you can answer questions about your business, about the health of your business, about why you make a great assignee, and about why the landlord has nothing to worry about in either consenting to this or just the nature of the transaction if the consent is not required. And I think it's really important to build that relationship as early as possible to streamline the transaction.
Got it. There's probably levels of sophistication, certainly levels of sophistication of a seller, but also levels of sophistication from a landlord's perspective, because there's probably small mom and pops that own strip centers, but then there's also the big, large national firms. Talk about how responsive they've been, I mean, it may be too generic of an answer, maybe to put that kind of an umbrella approach, but compare and contrast the differences of size and sophistication of a landlord.
It's a great question. And I would say landlords are not like snowflakes. No two are exactly alike.
Right.
Some of the mom and pops are so great to deal with and so easy to deal with because you're dealing one-on-one with them. Others are non-responsive or, don't really have that level of sophistication. So that depends. And then from a larger landlord perspective, sometimes it's really easy because they've done this so many times before. Maybe you have them in elsewhere in your portfolio and that can help out. So you have an existing relationship with the landlord. Other times I've had them in my portfolio and they've treated me like they've never heard of us before in my life. So it really runs the gamut. Some of them just have a checklist that they have to go through, right? And they have their bureaucracy, their red tape. No matter what, they're gonna go through their checklist. The one thing I would caution any sellers out there on is one of the famous last words I hear is, "Oh, I have a great relationship with my landlords." Yep, all set. Great relationship with my landlords. It is always the longest process in an M&A transaction. I think maybe one was not the case, one exception to that rule. It is a hard process, even if you have a good relationship with your landlords, because like I said, some of them are just very bureaucratic. Some of them want a pound of flesh.
Yeah. Well, Terry, you can probably add to that because you can have a good relationship with your landlord until it's not so good, right?
That's for sure. And some of the mom and pops do handshake deals, so you can't be guaranteed of anything. They made an agreement, they just they refused to put it in writing. So you have to rely that they're going to honor that, and you don't always know if it's going to happen. But I will say, from my perspective, it is usually a cleaner transaction when it is the more sophisticated. Obviously, I mean, that seems obvious, but it is a lot neater on our end to get the data because they already have it. They provide it. In the mom and pops, it's a lot of back and forth and messy.
Yeah. Yeah. What does a seller typically need to do in advance from that initial, Steve, maybe when you express interest? Do you find that sellers are organized, or do you have any advice to them to package up the information that you would be looking for?
I mean, I think it's always best if you can go ahead and abstract your own leases. I think it's a great idea, right? Because it's going to help you immensely when you come to the sale process, because you're going to understand where your holes are as well. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had a First Amendment, a Second Amendment, and a Fourth Amendment. No Third Amendment, right? They just don't have it. Or maybe it was never signed. I have leases that were never dated. I have lack of delivery dates, right? So you don't have that information. As we all know, leases often refer to other things in order to establish an expiration date or a renewal deadline, right? The rent commencement date is not the date that the lease was signed, but the date that it was 120 days after delivery. So you don't have a delivery date, you don't have a rent commencement date, you don't have an expiration date. It snowballs. So having that information available and understanding what you may not have available is definitely going to be advantageous in streamlining this process, because you can then start to go gather it, as opposed to me reviewing it, realizing you don't have that Third Amendment available, you don't have a rent commencement date, et cetera, and me having to go after it.
Yeah. Well, you touched on contingencies, that the rent commencement doesn't occur until you get a C of O or 180 days prior to grand opening. So a lot of those things are written, but there's no one date that anchors everything. I mean, Tara, what's your sense of what you've seen in the market? Are those dates, across the board pretty tight, or is there a certain percentage where it's still loose, when you start to do the lease abstraction?
I would say at least 60% of the time. I think the number's higher. It's not fixed in the lease. And if you've already done the acquisition, it's going to be that much harder to find out when you got the C of O, when the grand opening was, and all these triggering dates. So if you see these leases beforehand and you know that this information is missing, it's much easier to get it before the close than after. I think we just looked that number up, and it may even be higher than 60% of leases without fixed dates.
It's fascinating. So in one sense, it could be, let me know what my lease renewal period is or what my lease renewal date is, you can almost turn it around and say, I think we need to help you with what your lease commencement date is. Right. That's fascinating. I don't know, Steve, anything you want to add? Have you seen any kind of horror stories? I mean, hopefully not post-acquisition, with regards to those contingent dates.
I haven't seen horror stories in the end results, Taj, but I've seen a lot of work that's needed to go into things to, go backwards, right? To start to understand what those dates were or whatever the case may be. And that's where those confirmation of lease terms or estoppels come in so important, because now you have that, right? You have that document signed by both parties that says this was the commencement date, this was the rent commencement date, this was the expiration date, this is the option deadline. That stuff becomes all that much more critical when you are missing a piece of information.
Got it. So we've encouraged, obviously, to have Q&A throughout this conversation and webinar. So some questions are starting to come in. Definitely encourage anyone to feel free to post your question on the Q&A and we'll answer them. So one question that came up was, and maybe you touched on this, but what's the number one tip to speed up a transaction? Tara, why don't you take that?
I'm just going to beat the dead horse of the estoppel. Just getting those dates. That's the biggest issue we find. You can't know when your rent escalation dates are. You don't know when your renewal notice is if you don't know when the lease commenced.
Got it. Okay. No, I mean, I think it's fair to say, and it's good to beat this dead horse, because just like you said, 60+% of leases don't have a fixed commencement date. If you don't have an estoppel, you don't have all those details. It takes so much time. So having a clean, fast, smarter deal, everybody wins, right? The buyer and the seller and potentially even the lender in the transaction. So speaking of lenders, I just brought that up, Steve. Tell me about their role in whether it's private equity or lender, your financing institution. What's their involvement? Do they come in late? Are they kind of parallel with you on the due diligence side? You can expand on that. That'd be great.
Yeah, I would call it pretty parallel, right? Because you obviously need to understand what their capacity is and willingness to enter into the transaction is pretty early on, right? Especially if you're relying on that to fund the deal. So I think you need to get that pretty early on, and then you will continue to work with them. You get a diligence request from them. They have access to the data room. They'll ask for those projections. They're, I would say, more involved with the financial end than anything else. They don't generally get too involved with the lease end until the end. And then they kind of rely on our due diligence more than anything. But heavily involved in the finance end, from reviewing the financial documents, reviewing what our projections are, our understanding of the business and what we can do to improve upon the business, things like that, synergies, etc.
Yeah, got it. This question came in on the chat. So talk about radius restrictions. I mean, how do you deal with those in a lease? Someone, a location you're acquiring that can conflict with your existing portfolio, or is that something you manage well in advance?
Yeah, I never allow radius restrictions in my leases to begin with, which is my tip number one. But especially if it's not a percentage lease, right? I always say to the landlord, if it's not a percentage lease, what are you concerned with on a radius restriction? And usually they can come off of that. But I understand in different industries, there are different acceptable practices for sure. I think I would just be open, right? And that is actually a critical element of any lease that you're reviewing, is if there's a radius restriction that you are acquiring a neighboring business from and you're instantly in violation of, obviously a major problem. I think that's where that phone call is critically important, and that discussion with the landlord of how do we solve this problem. Yeah.
You mentioned making certain that you don't give up rights, or you try not to give up rights as you're acquiring. What rights do you want to add on? Like if there's something missing, what do you typically look at, Steve?
I think that's one, it's such a difficult thing to do in this process, especially if you're asking for consent, right? So I think the tip there is understanding your leverage point more than anything. Now, in theory, the landlord may be getting a more credit-worthy tenant that they are happier to be with, in which case they may get something. if you are asking for something, you should be prepared to give something, right? Landlord might want you to exercise the first of your 5-year options, something like that, right? In exchange for anything. My most important thing is, especially in an assignment, is the assignment language, right? So I will take the opportunity to negotiate a change, an amendment to the assignment language so that I don't have to go back to the landlord and broaden the excluded transactions. And what an excluded transaction is a transaction that doesn't require consent from the landlord in the future. So if I know that, we might be in a position to sell at a later date or whatever the case may be, I will try to negotiate that in that assignment.
Yeah. And that's smart. I mean, because you're planning for the future. Like,
Exactly.
why recreate the headache that you just tried to overcome here with the acquisition?
And I mean, we could, I mean, there are so many signage, if you want to improve signage, you want to improve other things, you want to expand the premises, that's obviously a prime thing to talk about. There are so many things that you could talk about, but that really varies depending upon your business and the specific situation, but definitely assess the situation, see if there's anything you want, and just understand what your leverage points are.
Yeah. Well, do you have any standard package to introduce yourself? And I know we're kind of going back to the beginning of the acquisition process, but the leverage points, as you indicated, I mean, CDM is obviously a really large entity, successful. You're growing. You've got a very tight operational model. So I could imagine that, it's a pretty powerful value prop. Do you send them like a pre-package to say, here's who we are, and this is why you want to partner with us?
Yeah, we really cultivate a letter that
Okay.
corresponds to the specific transaction. We might, very high level stats, 80 clubs, extensive revenue, operating history, experience, that type of thing. But, we're obviously not going to enclose, sorry, here, my light's going off. We're not going to enclose financials or anything like that in the initial letter, right? So it's very high level. It's a one pager to introduce them. And then when you get into that phone call or when you get that formal intro, that's when you need to get an NDA signed and things like that if you want to disclose those additional items.
Got it. Anything you want to add to that, Tara?
Well, I mean, to back up a little, when you were talking about what concessions do you want to get, that would be the opportunity. Exercise your option and maybe keep your exclusive, or agree to exercise the option ahead just to keep the options. Those things that go away with the assignment. I have seen a lot of that in the assignment itself, where they amend the lease at the same time as the assignment.
Got it. So we spent a lot of time talking about the real estate due diligence, but there's other things that are going on simultaneously with regards to accounting and tax and systems. How does that all work? Is that in parallel? Is that part of your purview, Steve?
Yeah, there's a ton going on in parallel, right? So your tax, you're probably, depending upon the size of the transaction, you're doing a quality of earnings. And there's a financial advisor that's doing a quality of earnings where they're, doing a forensic accounting and assessing whether or not the EBITDA that is presented in the LOI is actually, creditable EBITDA. And then in addition to that, there's tax review, audits, things like that that are going on. And then you have, a lot of times you have what's called representation and warranties insurance. So that's ensuring that, effectively you get coverage for the representations and warranties made by the seller, but the company does a pretty in-depth audit into the situation of the business. And that includes all areas of the business. So potential litigation, any risks that are available or, that might present themselves for the seller. That's a whole process as well that's ongoing. And then, obviously in a franchise business, there's a franchisor element, right? You have franchise agreements that are going to be assigned. You have potentially area development agreements that are going to be assigned. So you're at the same time negotiating those documents with your franchisor. So it is if you had a Gantt chart, there'd be a lot of lines going across, right? Happening at the same time in order to streamline the process. If you were to wait for one at a time, these things would take, years instead of months.
makes sense. What about, because you talked about equipment and other systems, the landlord's responsibility for, let's say, HVAC. I mean, at what point in time do those things surface, or the age of the units, or roof repairs, or resurfacing, those kinds of things? To what extent is that part of your process too?
I think that's, again, one of those elements of understanding what the lease says, right? So understanding who's responsible for what, and then that's going to affect that negotiation with the buyer. If there are any purchase price adjustments, right? So we're going to go in post LOI certainly, and we're going to survey the property, and we're going to probably do it multiple times, right? We're going to take an initial look at the property, and then as we get a little bit further down the due diligence line, we're going to do subsequent inspections and more detailed inspections. We're going to have our HVAC maintenance contractor go take a look at that HVAC system. It's a huge expense if you need a new RTU or things like that. Obviously, if the roof's in poor quality, generally speaking, I've rarely seen a roof be on a tenant in a straightforward rental. Sometimes in a ground lease or things like that, it will be, but that's something, again, that you need to then have that conversation with the landlord of, what are your plans for this roof? What are your plans for that parking lot? All of that stuff. You really need to go in eyes wide open, and it's critical that you do that earlier than later, because those are the things probably more often than not that I see end up in purchase price adjustments.
Yeah. So you mentioned that twice now, purchase price adjustments. Like, what does that mean? And what are some examples of that? Give us some real world situations.
Sure. So let's say you agree to a $5 million purchase of a business. You're doing your due diligence, and you discover that, let's say there's 10 units, and, 2 of the units need brand new HVAC systems. And those are going to cost you, $100K each. Well, that might result in a purchase price adjustment of $200,000. Or it might be really what ends up happening, right, is it's a negotiation of that, right? So it might not be $200,000, but maybe it's $80,000. And so much of that depends on the relationship between buyer and seller, the leverage buyer and seller have, the relative leverage. And then, of course, there's different schools of thought on who's getting the benefit of the sort of useful life of the unit, right? Because in theory, you're putting a brand new unit on, the buyer is going to get the benefit of the useful life of that unit. But if it's been neglected and it's overdue for replacement, the counter is, well, you should have done this 3 years ago, 4 years ago. It's well overdue. This is on you.
How long? What's the shortest time frame you've gone through a due diligence and an acquisition to the longest time frame? To put it in perspective, what have you seen?
Longest I can say was about a year, and that was in COVID. So naturally, there was some external factors there that resulted in an extended period of time. Shortest was probably about 2 months.
Wow, fascinating. So give us some examples of why it was short.
In the 2 months, that was that one exception where the leasing did not take the longest in the deal, right? I mentioned that one exception where it didn't happen. Usually that process is a couple months in and of itself, right? Because again, those leases just have those provisions. It's 30 days for review. It's, whatever the case may be. And in that particular scenario, that just, it kind of all came together, right? Funding was lined up. It was, and I would say that the seller in that scenario was as prepared and had negotiated the best leases I had ever seen, right? And they were prepared, they were good to go. They had the documentation, they had the abstracts. It was a relatively easy review, and we rocked and rolled.
Got it. So on average, I'm going to turn this over to you, Tara. On average, what's the expected time frame, or what should people kind of budget in their head from a overall time frame from start to finish of closing a deal?
For abstraction, or
for the real estate process, is it 2 months? Should they factor in a longer period of time, or what's the average that you would?
I can't give you an average. It really depends, just like Steve said, how prepared the seller is, or the willingness of the landlord. But I think you probably need 2 months on average to make sure you have all the information needed to move forward.
Okay. Yeah. That's helpful. So we're learning a lot. One of the questions that came through is with regards to personal guarantees. I think this is probably related to the strength of the buyer, and how do you respond to a landlord that is asking for a personal guarantee? And maybe there was already one previously. So I don't know, Steve, what have you seen?
The answer is no. No, we're private equity backed. We have 80 units, right? We're not going to grant any personal guarantees. However, we will be reasonable on granting cross collateralization, meaning we have a lot of single purpose entities that operate our individual locations, and we'll grant guarantees from other entities, right? And we want to be reasonable there. And again, it's all about that relationship and that conversation with the landlord and the back and forth there. And we do want to try to help release any of those personal guarantees. In most cases, it's very rare that an assigned lease has an automatic release of a personal guarantee. So that personal guarantee carries forward with it. The other option I would say, just so everybody's aware, is in the purchase agreement itself, you can agree to an indemnification provision where the guarantor is got some protection from the buyer that they will indemnify the guarantor in the event something happens. So if you can't get that personal guarantee released and you're a seller, you want to get that indemnification from the buyer.
Makes sense. Tara, have you seen a chain of personal guarantees that kind of go on and on and on when different transactions happen? I think
Absolutely. Like you said, they're not released. They're on the hook. Keeps going and going. On occasion, some more sophisticated guarantors will get themselves an out after maybe 3 years if they're lucky. But a lot of times we will see multiple assignments and that same guarantee from the original lease is still on the hook.
And that's one thing I would say, Taj, there is just in that negotiation of the lease, if you can negotiate a burn off, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, at that point, theoretically, they have no unamortized tenant improvement allowance left. You should be able to leverage that after a certain period of time. So at least you know that there's an end at some point.
Yeah. Because I think, Tara, you and your team have brought to light the fact that there are some guarantors that have no knowledge that they were still a guarantor, right? From 1990 or 2000.
There's no requirement. In some of these, it says you're not required to consent and you just are on it. We've also seen where they trade in and out guarantors as well. So they release the first one, a new one comes on, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but there's no notice requirement of all the prior chain of guarantors. Like, hey,
there isn't always. There can be a requirement that the guarantor has to be notified, but it's not always.
That's wild. Cool. So a question came out, and we're going to be creating a checklist for sellers to know how to best prepare. Great question. I'm so glad you asked that. I mean, we have the same checklist for buyers and the same checklist for sellers. So look for something here in the next week that we'll be sending out. Wonderful. Because I mean, that's what this is all about. Like, how does everybody get better prepared for cleaner, faster, smarter deals? I think we've heard in multiple cases when the real estate due diligence happens, like on the Monday or Tuesday of the following week, and there were 3 things that needed to take place. You need to hire a paralegal, needed a spreadsheet, and needed that weekend. I mean, it's just crazy. $100 million deals are hinged on, oh crap, we should make sure that these acquisitions of the lease and the obligations are clean. So it's just really kind of crazy how the market is, but it's changing, right? So thanks for everybody's feedback here. So Steve, how big is your team? Let's talk about like the real estate side of it. You've made, was it like 40 plus, I think, different unit acquisitions over the 7 deals. How do you do it? Is it by yourself, or you've got a team on the real estate side specifically?
Yeah, on the real estate side specifically, it's really a team of about 3 people that are doing it. But we have on the real estate side, we do everything. We do the assignment negotiations, we do the review of the leases, the abstraction. I will say, and I know this isn't a sales pitch, LeaseCake is a huge help there too, right? We have utilized LeaseCake for abstraction services of the leases in advance of the transaction. And that can be a huge help too. And it is much more cost effective than hiring outside counsel to do that. In my opinion, I'm not saying you shouldn't hire outside counsel to do that, but in my opinion, it's more cost effective. And frankly, when you're hiring outside counsel to do it, I think the abstractors at LeaseCake have probably way more familiarity and are better at doing it than most lawyers. That's, again, just my opinion. So we're able to keep the team to about 3 with the outside help that we get from legal counsel and LeaseCake.
Well, thank you for that. Appreciate it. Tara, you've probably seen some transactions within our system of buyers and sellers. I guess, to what extent is having all of your information organized? Are those transactions relatively smoother, or, tell me what you've seen, kind of worst case to best case.
It depends. If you do it beforehand, we're here. What we do is we identify the gaps for you, and you have that time before the closing to get that information. We also see it afterwards where we've had very clean deals and very messy deals. And like I mentioned, the handshake deals, you don't really know what you've got. You don't know if the landlord considers these options still, still able to be used. And sometimes they just can never get the documents. And so there's just material gaps that will always be there. So we see the whole gamut, clean to messy.
Yeah. Well, nobody likes surprises. So the guarantor questions kind of coming up again from the chat. So thank you, everybody, for your questions. Keep them coming in. Is it common for a buyer to work with the seller to have the seller removed as a guarantor? I think you already touched on that a little bit, but what's the leverage? Is it just the fact that you're well backed and that the landlord shouldn't be concerned?
Exactly. And it's a relationship thing too, right? You just try to be as polite and courteous as possible. They understand why the seller wants to get off of the guarantee. Landlord's still protected. We've had a lot of success in doing that, actually.
It's good to know. Good to know. What about TI allowances? Are you able to get additional TI allowances, or?
We have in certain circumstances. Those generally occur obviously with a new term of some kind, right? Whether it's exercising an option, whether it's negotiating an all new lease, something like that. Very rarely is it going to happen with a straight assignment, because what's the landlord getting out of that? Unless you're going to increase rent or something like that, they're going to want their pound of flesh. But yeah, I've absolutely had situations, especially in situations where we were buying, for lack of a better term, an inferior asset, right? An inferior asset seller, where we're coming in, maybe it wasn't a Planet Fitness and now they're getting a Planet Fitness. The landlord's getting something out of that and they want us there, as opposed to somebody who is not as creditworthy.
Yeah. Anything you want to add, Tara? Good.
No, I don't have much experience noticing tenant improvement allowances being added at the time of acquisition, but I think if you do the new lease, like Steve says, we've probably encountered that a few times.
Yeah. There's a term that you probably have heard, right? Begin with the end in mind. And I think, Steve, you've very much espoused that, right? Like when you get into the franchise business, it doesn't matter whether you're in the gym business, fitness business, restaurant business, that there will be an exit at some point. And a lot of people aren't prepared. They're not really thinking about, well, I'm never going to sell. This is my thing. But beginning with the end in mind is important. So how do you, what's your best advice for someone that's just, near that tipping point where they're at 5 units, 10 units, 20 units? They may not be thinking about M&A, but what would you give them from an advice perspective to make certain that they're ready?
Yeah, think about M&A first and foremost, right? If you're not thinking about an M&A, think about M&A, because when you're negotiating your leases, that's the time where you can do it more than any other time. It is way harder to go back and change a lease term, I think, as Tara indicated earlier, than it is to negotiate it up front. Obviously, tip 2 would be understand the leverage points, right? Yeah. Because you're only going to be able to negotiate if you have that leverage, and understand it's all levers. Just like when we're doing TI, lower rent, free rent periods, all of that stuff, landlord work, it's all levers, and you just have to understand the market and negotiate accordingly. And then preparation would be the other thing, right? When I say preparation, it's organization, it's accurate documentation, it's utilizing software partners, whether it's LeaseCake or any other software partner, right? Accounting software, anything like that, a CRM, a good CRM platform, so that you have that information readily available. It seems like it's easy at 5 units, but as you continue to grow, it just gets harder to keep up with that stuff. So if you implement one of those systems sooner along, you're going to be ready for that when it comes along.
Yeah. That's really important feedback. What I think tied to that is communication. How do you make certain that everybody internally and externally is in the loop? I mean, is it just big, massive email chains? You do check-in phone calls during the process. I mean, what do you find that has worked the best, Steve?
Yeah, we create what's called a master action plan, and we update that on a weekly basis with the deal team. And so we have, pivotal leaders involved with the deal team, and then they'll trickle it down to their teams as necessary. So that cross-functionally, we understand where the deal's at, where the holdups are, where the progress is. I think that communication is critically important amongst internally the seller team, the buyer team, and anybody else who's involved in the transaction. Obviously, it goes to lenders, it goes to insurance providers, it goes to the lawyers, the legal teams, right? So we have our legal team call on a weekly basis as well, just to quickly and efficiently, so you're not racking up those legal bills, assess where we're at and what the next steps are to get this thing closed.
So you heard it here. So it's a master action plan. You call it a MAP.
Yeah.
It's sounds like it's project management 101, right? But just getting ahead of it, saying who are all the stakeholders? Is there any other secret sauce in that, or is it just?
Who are all the stakeholders? What are they responsible for? What are the lead times to be expected there? What are the holdups, what are the bottlenecks? That type of thing, where you understand the issues you're facing, and what it allows you to do is how to identify those issues as quickly as possible, so that you can prepare for them and then get around them.
Got it. Question from one of our friends out there. So who on your team does the lease negotiations, or do you hire a broker to negotiate and do all that?
I get the good fortune of doing that myself. And I love doing that. I'm a control freak, so that's part of it. I think it depends on your comfort level, to be perfectly honest with you. We have not hired brokers in the past. I've had the good fortune of having quite a bit of lease negotiation experience, so I feel comfortable there. But absolutely, if you have a little bit less experience, hiring a broker, hiring a professional, obviously legal counsel is critically important. And by the way, if I were not a lawyer, I would not negotiate the assignments myself. I've done that. I play one on TV, so it works out okay. But definitely solid legal counsel and real estate professionals who know what they're doing.
Got it.
Real quick, on the lawyer end too, an estate planning lawyer is not equivalent to a real estate lawyer, is not equivalent to an M&A lawyer. So that's something really important to understand too, because a lot of sellers that I've dealt with, and you asked about things that hold things up, that legal professional is critically important. And when they're a generalist, no offense to those generalists out there, it can really hold the deal up.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. It's kind of like going in for brain surgery. You don't want a general practitioner, right? Whether M&A is brain surgery or not, like you've got to find expertise in that specific market. What we didn't really talk about this, but what kind of support does the franchisor provide you during the M&A process?
It probably differs amongst the franchisors. In Planet Fitness, not a whole lot. We have a lot of sophisticated franchisees, obviously private equity backed and whatnot. So there's not a whole lot. One thing that they do help, one thing that our franchisor does, which is great, is that they do assess compliance. And, they want to make sure that compliance is upheld. I think Planet Fitness does a great job of that. That's why you see consistency in the brand. That's why you see the success of the brand. And so they will, sort of do a compliance check and ensure that the unit is in compliance. And if anything needs to be done, it has to get done, right? As part of the transaction. So that's another one of those issues for us specifically, where it might be a negotiation with the seller as to who's responsible for what needs to be done.
Yeah. So that's a good checklist item for a seller to say, make sure that you've got your scorecard in place and you've met all the requirements, because you want to, as the buyer, you want to make sure that that's done well in advance. Good deal. Good deal. Business continuity. I imagine it's going to depend on how strong your existing team is while you're going through an M&A transaction. So this question came in like, how do you keep all of the systems working for your existing operations while you're looking to acquire 12 units?
Yeah, that's just about communication. And, as far as business continuity of our existing units, we don't really have a problem with that because the M&A team is a little bit different than the continuous operations team. We have somebody who kind of helps on the operations side, but those clubs are already there. From an acquisition perspective, though, it's really important to make sure that there's not a huge hiccup in the operations of the target. I think that's probably the most important thing. And that's about communicating with those teams as soon as everybody feels comfortable, right? I think that making sure that the target employees feel comfortable with what's happening, especially in our franchise system, chances are you're trying to keep those employees. We like to keep those employees, when we do an acquisition, and I think we like to learn from targets as well. We don't presume that we do everything the best. So when we acquire a target or when we're talking to a target, we try to take best practices from them and work with them as opposed to force things down their throat. And I would say any adjustments that do need to be made, make them over time, right? Don't slam it down everybody's throat on day one. Make them over time, allow them to adjust a little bit. It's probably a very scary situation to be that target, to be on that side. You don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty and things like that. Make them feel as comfortable as possible, assess, and then make changes.
Yeah. Well, that's really well said because, as an acquirer, you would pretty much communicate, hey, nothing's going to change until something does. So that uncertainty is you don't want that to screw up the potential ongoing operations. Related to people, and this might be a little bit specific, but profit sharing agreements as it relates to assignment, especially when there's percent of sales over a certain period of time. Have you ever seen any kind of I don't know, a way of handling profit sharing agreements that are assigned, or is that something we'll have to take offline?
I don't know about you. I haven't seen a profit sharing on a percentage of the acquisition price. I've seen a profit sharing on if the amount of rent goes up and say a sublease, right? So in other words, you have a lease, you're paying $15, you're going to charge your assignee or your subtenant $20. Then the landlord's entitled to 50%. I don't know necessarily how you get around that, but I've never seen it in an acquisition price.
Got it. That's helpful. Okay. M&A broker. We talked about real estate brokers to assist you, but what do you look for in an M&A broker? I mean, Tara, you want to take this and I'll turn it over to Steve.
I'm going to let Steve take this one. I don't have the experience on this side. In my prior life, I worked at a landlord, for a landlord, and we did it all in-house. So I'll let Steve take it.
Yeah, on an M&A broker, I think it's critically important to have somebody with a good reputation in the market. You want them to be plugged in to understand what the going rates are, right? In our world, it's all about multiples on EBITDA. And we have several reputable brokers that people deal with, and they can be really great. They can make or break a transaction for sure. But I think just reputable, you want to trust them, right? When you're dealing with them. These are people who are going to be arguably the most important relationship you have, right? You're selling your business. So make sure you trust them, make sure they have the good relationships, and make sure they take the time to understand your business and your goals, right? Because your goals could be different, right? Do you want to roll over an investment into your buyer? Do you want to get out completely? Are you expecting to continue with a role? Because that's going to be completely different. That's going to involve employment agreements. That's going to involve additional contracts. That's going to involve a salary negotiation, things like that. So just make sure they take the time to understand your goals.
Great. Well, we're coming up near the top of the hour. Let's try to do a recap here. So what are the three primary takeaways? First was estoppel certs, right? Making sure you have all of that in order. That's number one. Number two, I love that. This, what is it called? The major action plan, right?
Master action plan. Yeah.
Master action plan. What's the third one?
I think prepare, right? Prepare would be the third one. The more preparation you put in, the better off, or the more streamlined the process is going to be.
Yep. Yep. Better outcomes. Okay. Well, I think we've covered it. Last comments to make, pearls of wisdom. What are you seeing in the market, Steve, from a real estate perspective, increased competition, consolidation? Give us your 1 minute take of the industry, if you could. We'll put you
Yeah, I
on
mean, I think real estate, you're starting to you're beginning to see the trickle down of availability of real estate, right? I think there's a lot of pent up demand in a lot of cases. I think it depends on the size of the box you're looking for and what you're looking for, but it's still really difficult out there. I think it's at least from what I've seen, it's still a landlord's market. You're seeing landlords less willing to write TI checks because they need to finance those and the interest rates are high. You're seeing landlords less willing to do work because it's more costly to do work and interest rates are high and lead times are tough. So I think it's a difficult market to negotiate deals in, but you're starting to see a little bit of that trickle down, in my experience.
Very cool. Yeah, the market's changed so dramatically over the last 5 years, certainly even the last 2 years, with private equity, competition, inflation. There's no new developments. So we can have a whole separate themed webinar on how do you make certain you find the right location and outcompete all the other players that are out there. Certainly in the fitness space, there's a bunch of them. Tara, any pearls of wisdom?
Just get a full set of lease files. Get all the information you can so you're the most prepared and know what you need to look for. What's important to you, just dig it out of those leases so you know what you're jumping into before you get started.
Begin with the end in mind. Prepare, prepare, prepare. There's no such thing as over communicating. I think lovely lessons from both of you. Thank you so much for sharing. We are going to conclude Lease Cake Live for today on M&A and the importance of due diligence. We've got some exciting webinars coming up with some really large franchisors that are in this space, and we're excited to host them as well, talking about what makes them succeed. So with that, we will sign off. Thank you so much, Steve and Tara. It's a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.